Hi, we're here today with Michael Dent at his wonderful aloe garden in the suburb of Taringa in Brisbane. Michael's just recently had his garden open to the public because this is the time of year we're actually filming in winter time when they're in their most floriferous state. What I'd like to talk to Michael about is what got you started in aloes. I mean, you've got your garden open, but just having your garden open is not the end of it. You actually eat, sleep, breathe, live aloes 7 days a week.
Quite right, yeah. I guess it was perhaps 10 years ago when Brisbane was in the peak of quite a severe drought. I sort of realised that we weren't growing flowers in Brisbane. If you drive down our streets, there weren't a lot of flowers. And I guess I was born in South Africa and I knew about aloes, and I knew that these new flowering aloes were big, easy growing flowering plants. So it was a way of people being able to grow flowers very easily and very reliably. So we looked to importing a range of plants that were bred by a breeder in Johannesburg, and we now market them across Australia.
Yep, through your nursery.
Yes, that's
Aloe
right.
Aloe.
Okay, that's right.
And that's a great idea too, because in winter there isn't as many things in flower, so it's great that they flower at that time of year with minimal water and care. What are some of the misconceptions of aloe plants in the garden, like in the suburban garden, that you find that people have struggled to sort of overcome, and you've managed to break down those barriers?
There are many misconceptions, Claire. The first one, most people only know about aloe vera, and of course vera is one of more than 700 different species of aloe, and it's one that's used for hand creams. So the flowering aloes are got nothing to do with vera. Vera is not really a good garden plant. The other misconception is that aloes are associated by many, quite wrongly, with the agaves or the cactus which come from America. In fact, aloes are lilies, effectively, from Africa, and they love these flowering aloes love the rain. So they're not desert plants at all. So they really love the rain. And in fact, during periods of rain, they thrive. It's just that they are able to store the water in their leaves so that in the dry times they can survive off what they've stored, and then when it rains again, they suck up the water again.
So in saying all of that, you're really saying they don't have to be just allocated with other succulent plants, and you don't have to have sort of, a xeriscape sort of garden to have aloes. You can have them with all sorts of other plants.
Of course, and there are many plants that will grow well with aloes. Things like begonias, things like there's actually most plants. Even if you love camellias, you can grow aloes with camellias. It's just that the companion plantings you use may need, if they need more water, the aloes will get more water. If they don't need a lot of water, the aloes will survive without that water.
So they're quite flexible.
Exactly,
and I'd have to say at home I'm having a bit of fun experimenting in my new garden, having them with natives as well as cottage plants, because they marry in quite well. And in your garden, which we'll have a look at, they're with daisies, they're with coleus, you've got them with a range of, you've got alströmerias, Peruvian lilies, you've got also a whole array of different types of flowering plants.
Yes, I actually particularly prefer planting aloes with other plants. I think a monoculture is fine, but really many contrasting leaf textures brings out the beauty in the aloes, and it's a much better for the garden than just having one culture.
And in pots, do they lend themselves to being in pots? Now I know that there's obviously, looking at the garden, there's a whole range. There's some small growing ones, medium growing ones, and then you've got some very, very tall species. Which ones would lend themselves best to pot culture, if at all?
They all are able to grow in pots because the root structure is not very huge. I would say the smaller ones or the medium-sized ones are perhaps best for pots for the reason the tall ones have a big rosette and it gets quite heavy. So the plant can easily fall over unless it's a really huge
big
pot. So the big ones will grow in pots, but they need to have a big pot, otherwise they become top heavy.
Okay, and once you've decided that you've become an aloe addict, a bit like myself, thanks to you, you have them in the garden, in the pots. What kind of care do they need? You say that they'll tolerate dry, they'll also tolerate a reasonable amount of moisture. Are there any other cultural tips that people should keep in mind once they're embarking on growing aloes?
Yes, they're very easy to grow. The maintenance required is perhaps just deadheading the spent flowers once they've finished flowering, and even that's not necessary, it's more aesthetic.
Yeah.
In terms of their growing requirements, they require good sunlight and free draining soil, but they do perform better with rich soil, so soil with humus in it. So in my garden we add cow manure in the spring to introduce to help the flowering, and it's a bit like an elite athlete. He's not going to do well if he has a poor diet. If he has a healthy diet, he'll be able to flourish. And of course, these aloes are bred to flower, so to give them that capability, it's good to
back
feed
it up
them
with some fertilizer.
And then, of course, in the really dry times, the aloes are not going to die if they don't get water. But if you have 4 months of no rain, which we've had before, they will benefit from some water, because it just keeps them healthy. And of course, a healthy aloe is a much better specimen, more disease resistant, and will flower better.
Okay, so the other benefits of keeping aloe, or some of the pros of having aloes, obviously the flowers are spectacular. They can be used as a cut flower, I've seen as well, quite successfully. What are some of the great reasons you would want to have aloes in the garden? You know, do they attract butterflies or bees or?
Yes, I mean there's many reasons, but that's perhaps one of the things that I found most exciting. Our gardens today are fairly sterile, and we don't see many bees and birds in the gardens. And having flowering plants like aloes, which have nectar in them, bring the nectar feeding birds, they bring the bees, they bring the butterflies, but they don't just bring the nectar feeding birds. Because they bring the insects, you get the insect feeding birds. So a whole biodiversity happens, and of course it happens at a time, as you said earlier, when there's not a lot in flower in the garden. So during the autumn and the winter months, so really the birds have got somewhere to go, the bees have got somewhere to go, be that native bees or introduced bees.
Okay, and so that's fabulous. Then you've got native bees, European honeybees, birds that are nectar sourcing, birds that are insectivorous. So there's a whole array of sort of, you know, I can see some beautiful blue-faced honeyeaters behind us now. And that's people are very conscious of that these days, I think, bringing in those things.
Yes, because a garden is not just a sterile space. It needs to. There's sounds, there's smells, there's activity, there's buds coming out. The whole of nature's cycle we need to embrace, and too often we have this view that someone gets a landscaper in, they put a garden in as if it's a piece of furniture, a sterile piece of furniture that looks the same all year round, and then that's not what gardening's about. It's about living with nature and nature's creatures.
Now here's a really hard question for you. I know this is quite cruel to ask you this, but in your range, I suppose you'd say you've got medium, small, tall. If you had to pick one from each range, which varieties would you say that you would have to choose, out of a small, a medium and a tall?
Very hard question.
Or which would be some of your favourites? So we'll assume that there's a myriad that you'd choose, but if you had to just pick a handful, which ones would you really strongly recommend?
Well, I guess one of the ones that I think is greatest, because it's a long flower, is one called Always Red, which has a red flower, but its flower's not the biggest of all, but because it spreads its flowering over a longer period. So it's great en masse because you just have this red for up to 9 months of the year. So that perhaps is if I were to pick a small one, but it's like you love all your children equally. A medium-sized one, I would think Copper Shower. Again, for the reason it's a long flower. It can start as a mature shrub. It starts flowering in as early as December, and it can go through to July. So that's a long period of repeat flowering. A shrub can flower 4 or 5 times over that period. So you've always got a copper colour on the
and that's great for people that have got smaller gardens too. You might think, oh no, I need a big garden to have all these aloes. You can actually, if you've only got a small space, know that you're going to really get a lot out of those plants if they're going to flower for that extended period. So now a big one?
Well, I can't go past Big Red, which is the one right behind us here.
Yep.
The big candelabras of the Big Red are just so impressive, and of course with aloes, as the plant matures, the flowering improves. So in time, the big specimens really get pretty huge in terms of their flower capabilities. Much in the same way as if you buy a little young azalea in a nursery, it doesn't look like much. But if you put that azalea in your garden and you're able to care for it, we all know what those big azalea bushes look like. I mean, the aloes are the same. Just wow, not just stocks or.
Yeah, so that's something people need to be aware of. You know, they might not look much when they're young, but it's
yes.
like a little ugly duckling. Once they've actually established and flowering, as you
Yes.
can see behind us, they're absolutely spectacular.
And that's so true of many plants people buy in pots. People equate the look of the plant in the pot to the final plant, but in many cases it's not the case. Particularly a flowering plant, it's not good. It's like seeing an orchid in a pot when it's not in flower.
Yeah.
You know, you just say, well, what's that? But when that orchid comes into flower, it's a different world. And that's what these aloes are all about, because many species aloes are not big flowers. And that's why people haven't really noticed them, because they haven't seen flowering of this magnitude before.
Well, thank you, Michael, for having us here today. I think it's been truly inspirational, and I hope we've possibly inspired some people, some viewers at home, to maybe think about having some aloes in their garden. I'd have to say the one behind us right now, Moonglow, is one of my favourites by a long shot. I just love it. So hopefully we'll see more and more aloes appearing in people's backyards. And what does the future hold for you and Aloe Aloe in your nursery and future breeding then?
Well, Claire, the bottom line is, if we want flowers, and if we want particularly the black thumb gardeners out there to grow flowers, and many of the black thumb gardeners have given up growing, even gardening, we have to have easy plants.
Yeah.
It's only with easy flowering plants will they have the confidence and the reliability to put a plant down, have a bud come out, have it open and enjoy it. So I think for tough flowers, you need to look wider for our palette of plants, and the flowering aloes are one of the options. And there are other options too, but I think that we really need to look to tougher flowering plants.
That's fantastic. Oh, well, I hope we see more varieties in store soon.
Certainly.
Thank you for having us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Claire.